G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and importantly a fantastic Friday leading into what I hope is an enjoyable but productive weekend. Now something I didn't mention yesterday which I should have is talking with my oncologist. I had like an hour long meeting and he's going to get back to me next week with those molecular results that haven't come in. But he did speak about neuro injury. And he said, you're in a bit of a hard spot because if we leave it and this keeps growing, you're going to start getting neurological deficits in changes in your ability for your limbs, especially my right arm and leg, but also the chance of having personality and attitude shifts as well. And he actually quizzed my partner for quite a while on if she'd noticed any of this. But he said on the other side, neuro injury can definitely be caused by further treatment. So it's a bit of a hard one of which is more protective to the brain because someone poking around there isn't great, but letting something grow is not great either. So I'll keep you guys informed with what is happening. And if you notice anything, probably let me know. We will see. So guys, today we do have a lot to talk about. Of course, we're going to go over the Financial Times article that we missed yesterday, speaking about the war, what's happening, and what changes we're probably going to see in the coming months, elections, everything. I want to talk about some data that have been sent across and opinions too in showing where this data is and showing how Russia moves in the front line and then has a bit of a lull and these peaks and troughs of movement, but also that increase exponential of ground being occupied. We also need to look at what the ISW has said as a bit more of a hybrid warfare informational thing that the Russians are trying to do, and we'll break that down. Also in that folder, we do have a lot of opinions we need to share as well, so there's a lot in that. And then, of course, we're going to be looking at the maps and we're going to be looking at geolocations as well as things that I find important or that are changing too. So we have a lot of maps to go over as there has been significant movements on the front line today. We need to look at the fortifications in there and where Russia on the advance is trying to go at the moment. But where I want to start is in my folder called Nukes and North Korea. It sounds like some level of album cover here, but what we have seen, and people are saying this is the first time, that is incorrect, that we're seeing Russia using North Korean vehicles. Here we can see a North Korean SPG, a self-propelled gun, of which North Korea has a absolutely massive amount of in Russia. We have seen some North Korean vehicles pop up on the front line that are ATGM sort of style system, so this isn't the first one, but of course, people saying that this is on the way to the front line amid what they are claiming of artillery shortages by the Russian forces. But also saying that North Korea doesn't have the capacity to refit barrels on these also, so I don't know how the original barrels got on there, but North Korea does have a massive amount of artillery if it was to then really build up with the Russian forces. But we can see where the geolocation actually is, or close enough, of in Krasnoyansk of where this artillery system was seen. So you can see that it is some 3,500 kilometers from Ukraine. Of course, Russia has massive distances to cover, making logistics a nightmare at some times. So will we see that pop up on the front line? Like we've been hearing claims of North Korean soldiers pop up. I hear more. I got an argument again yesterday with someone who should know better than this from the position he worked in previously. Oh, North Koreans are abandoning positions. They're being killed. That article, they're being killed in such large numbers that the Ukrainian soldiers feel bad. Everything in this war is filmed. It would be absolutely in Ukraine's interest if there is any footage that shows North Koreans deployment, North Koreans abandoning, any of that, to make that public as soon as possible. In my opinion, I have seen zero evidence of North Koreans yet entering the battlefield, whether in Kursk or in other areas. I don't care about titles online, I care about evidence. There's no evidence of this yet. Will we see it? I think likely yes. Will it change things? I think likely no. I don't think it will change things greatly for the Russians, and I don't think it will change things as far as policy from the US into Ukraine also. But I think if it was to have more of an effect one way or another, it will affect how other countries may support Ukraine more so than how 10,000 soldiers would bolster Russia's pushes. So let's talk about nukes. Now, I spoke yesterday about Ukraine potentially looking to acquire or create a nuclear weapon. There's a few things I skipped over there and a few things that I was likely incorrect on. So I've been corrected here, or at least more information, nuance added from a guy who does some stuff for me. Fantastic amount of information. I'll go right to the issue. It's bullshit. It is another way to threaten the Western nations to keep giving Ukraine aid. So if you don't keep aiding us, we will become a nuclear power. Ukraine does not even produce its own nuclear fuel. It used to buy fuel from Russia before 2014, and now it does from the US. Producing your own nuclear fuel is much easier than producing weapons-grade plutonium. Very few countries can do nuclear reprocessing. China, France, India, Israel, Pakistan, Russia, and the US. UK apparently shut its last plant in 2022. Keep in mind that Ukraine did not give up its nuclear weapons because they were very peace-loving people. They did not have the proper facilities to maintain them. This is why the US and pretty much all Western countries pressured Ukraine to give their weapons up. Actually, the US paid for the cost of transport. They spent $300 million at that time to this end, plus some deal sweetener for Ukraine. If you cannot produce the weapons-grade plutonium properly, there is a risk of spontaneous detonation. Pu-240 goes into fission on its own. So if Ukraine really attempts this, there is a chance of a nuclear explosion in Ukraine and people blaming Russia for it. So a country that has no experience in nuclear reprocessing can obtain nuclear weapons and it works. That is a James Bond story. I believe a spontaneous detonation causing Ukraine to hit itself is more likely than Ukraine hitting somewhere meaningful in Russia. That is speculation. But I looked into this idea of reprocessing, and people will say, well, Ukraine had a massive nuclear arsenal. They used to maintain systems. That is absolutely true, but the reprocessing was not done there. So Ukraine did not conduct nuclear reprocessing for weapons purposes, even during the Soviet era, while the Soviet Union managed nuclear fuel weapons production. Ukraine's nuclear infrastructure was generally focused on the development, storage, and potential launch of nuclear weapons under Moscow's control, but it did not independently engage in nuclear reprocessing or weapons-grade material production. So it's not the whole hog, as some people will try and sell. Also, even if it works, Russia has lost over 100,000 people so far to make sure Ukraine won't join NATO. What makes people think that Russia losing another 100,000 from Ukrainian nuclear weapons would make Russia give up? The other way here is what makes it that Russia won't respond with their own attack. Rather, they would just go on a rampage on Ukraine. I hardly think that Western countries would want to come between Nazgul and its prey. Nazgul were originally the 9 kings who were given to the Rings of Power by Sauron, the Dark Lord. I think it's a Lord of the Rings thing. I'm not really sure here. But talking about the power of those nuclear weapons that Russia will have, if then they step in on that, will someone want to get in between this and expand it? So the best Ukraine can ever do is a dirty bomb. I don't think they would even do that. Even a dirty bomb would turn Ukraine into a terrorist state, some state no Western country would like to be associated with. These are my 2 cents on this. So of course, Ukraine want to maintain that aid, and I do agree with that there's probably this idea of informational war. If we can't get the aid, we need to step to be a nuclear power. And which one would the West prefer? Probably give more aid. So that is a very interesting take on this presented. Thank you for sending that across. This is something which, if this is the way the war ends, my God. So from a Russian page, it says, in December 24, Russia will hold exercises to disconnect the Russian segment of the internet from the global network. The reasons are obvious. In the event of a full-fledged war with NATO, they will try to bring down the entire network infrastructure of the Russian connected to the Western part of the global network in the shortest possible time. Therefore, in the conditions of a hot war with the West, we will have to exist within the framework of our segment. Testing such scenarios is an urgent need, even without references to the need to test the stability of our segment of the internet in the face of ongoing cyber attacks on our network infrastructure. It only remains to hope the exercises will be successful and that the services that people need, including those used in the interests of the troops and actions in Ukraine, will not collapse in the process. So imagine if that test was done, you hit Control-Alt-Delete and everything goes down. So that'll be something which I think those guys would be holding their breath for. Now, before we have a look at the maps, I want to show you a couple of projections and graphs and some data about some gains. Now, I'm going to read you this first, and then we will look at the data on a spreadsheet. After your recent comments about the pace of Russian advances, I thought I would graph the data to see if there were any patterns to see. I compare the daily changes over October, November, and it seems as a bit of a cycle where there are 2 or 3 days of big gains and then a lull for a couple of days, then another push. So let's have a look at this graph. So you can see where there is a few days of large gains and then a lull for that time or more, well, minimum of that time, to maybe refit and then launch another attack. This cycle doesn't seem to have changed between the 2 months. It would be better to grab more long-term data to see if it trends, but I would say the level of gain has significantly scaled up. It's hard to say why definitively without additional information. It could be a boost to intensity and material by the Russians, or maybe a case of getting through a layer of fortifications in a particular area. So talking about, we can see on like the data graph here, that by Deep State and Warmapper, that not only has Russia continued to gain ground, but they're gaining at an increased rate. What exactly is the reason for this? It is many things on the Russian side, and it's also things on the Ukrainian side here as well. It's not just one item. Now, much like a condensed version of the massive Russian gains post the fall of Avdiivka, where we saw a rapid advance up to the next layer and then a slowdown. I was also interested to see what long-term looked like and plotted the monthly data from 22 onwards. I'll show you in a sec. I would say this data supports your view around the change from manoeuvre stage to attritional of conflict at the end of 2022. It has been a state of ebb and flow ever since, with an upwards trend overall, which very much supports that idea of consistent effort over a long period will win a war. So what I've said is I believe that near the end of 2022 is when Russia said this isn't a maneuver war anymore due to drones and Ukraine's success with anti-armoured weapon systems and Russia's inability to gain full air superiority, and then changed into an attritional war. Conscription matches this, picking up industry matches this. And this is where I've just drawn in here, nearing the end of 22, we've seen where these massive changes in territories, of course, hit, even taking into account Kharkiv, Kherson, and this attritional aspect and very slow grind forwards. Like I've said, I think that's the reason we saw everything really slow down through 23, was this acceptance of attritional war. Personally, I think when we consider the Taliban quote, you have the watches, but we have the time, it should really be, and also the discipline to sustainably manage our resources over the long haul. I think the Russians have made this realization, but the Ukrainians are stuck with their hands permanently out, and eventually they will be empty. I've said this before. I think Russia was first to acknowledge that this is an attritional war. What do we need? Men, shells, whatever, as there was a shortage of that, and we saw Ukraine take back large amounts of land. But I believe Ukraine has always relied on reintroducing maneuver into the battlefield, which I've said I don't know if that is possible. And you can go back and use those graphs and have a look at them as you would like. But I want to talk about what John Helen has said. If you don't follow him on Twitter, go and have a follow. Really interesting stuff. Just a heads up for any journalist who is not as terminally Ukraine as I am. This guy, who he refers to, this Chuck Farrar, he does some podcasts. He's an author. And I believe ex-Navy SEAL as well. But he said he's not a credible source, certainly not a leading figure, and painting the current situation as anything but bleak for Ukraine is downright irresponsible. So he's saying if someone's painting something as not bleak, it's irresponsible here. And we'll look over a couple more things. But I wanted to expand on what he says here, as there is a comment that many people would be asking to me right now. So I'm supposed to ignore the fact that the artillery war is almost at parity in shells fired and Russian casualties have never been higher, and pretend Russia is winning a war of attrition because of some towns taken in Donbass. John replies and says, not because the town's taken in Donbass, but because Ukrainian mobilization has largely failed to create the reinforcements needed, and they are scourging for infantry from medical personnel, headquarters, and airfield ground crews, which we know through a number of articles and statements from the Commander of the Air Force is true to some degree also. But to say that Russia isn't winning the attritional war, I believe would go back to what Helen said is downright irresponsible, because that can affect decisions too. And Tig says here, it might sound ridiculous, but if this trajectory goes on, Ukrainians might lose some artillery parity. All Russians have to do is to treat Ukrainian infantrymen, and Ukrainians will put their artillerymen into the front and they will die too. And John says this is what happened in Avdiivka. Now, what he's getting at here is with this manpower problem, that the most important soldiers first is infantry. But if you're having to redeploy people from other areas into the infantry, that area therefore is going to suffer the most. And this artillery parity, which I'm not sure if there is parity, I would question that, at least on shells fired, but regardless, take that as true for this exercise, that can start limiting if you don't have the men to backfill also. So very interesting there. Now, John says, Russia is advancing faster, as I've shown you with that data, than any point since summer 22, according to some calculations, faster than 23. The reason is, I believe, that attritional warfare and what is coming home to roost. There is no immediate fear of large-scale collapse, but it's clear that the current situation is simply not sustainable for Ukraine with no easy ways out. In 22, both sides were running out of forces and means to continue the war, but Russia was burning out faster pre-mobilization. Now, Ukraine is the one that seems to deplete itself first, if no negotiations happen before this. So what I've said in this war, the victor will be who breaks first. Who is burning out? If there's two candles burning, one is Ukraine, one is Russia, which are burning quicker? And I believe still, regardless of weapon systems, regardless of losses, regardless of drone footage, that Ukraine is looking like it will have some level of break first, given the manpower shortages, which is so hard to fix. People can talk about the artillery shortage. North Korea can really help Russia with that. It doesn't look like Russia's having too much problem with that, like in 22-23, where its massive problem was barrels and shells that had been fixed. And like that person stated in the data and what he sent across is, like I've been saying, I think Russia, the reason they've ended up in this position was that acceptance of the M22 of this is attritional, we're not going to win via maneuver, and focus on mobilization, recruitment, and shells in just en masse, and seeing that quantity is a quality of its own, rather than Ukraine maybe focusing on having better Leopard tanks, better Abrams tanks and F-16s, and looking at helicopters to try and reintroduce maybe maneuver warfare into an attritional war, if that is possible, and not focusing on as much just massive men and shells that Russia did. And of course, this is due to, like in the last paragraph he wrote, because Ukraine is reliant on the West and what it will give. That's where you can have issues here. Now, the ISW has had this very interesting piece. Russia can't defeat Ukraine or the West, and will likely lose if the West mobilizes its resources to resist the Kremlin. If we lean in and surge, Russia loses. So what it's trying to show here is what is the basis of the Kremlin's real power. So what is the real power the Kremlin has? Niche military capabilities, not spoken about much, but propulsion, nuclear, some of this, nuclear weapons, global footprint, pipelines, oil, gas, things like this. And of course, something missed in here is it's the largest exporter of grain in the world. Also, they go through the blind spots, they go through amplifiers of this. So how is this being sold to the world? And perceptions of the Kremlin, that it is a great power, that it deserves a sphere of influence, whatever. So it's saying this is the base, this is what has come out as the perception of this, and this is why, to quote them, if we lean in by we the West and surge, Russia loses. Now, the comments under this article are absolutely scathing. I couldn't find one positive one. But what happens in this is it ignores two incredibly obvious questions, and I went through the article and Control F, whatever it is to search, didn't bring this up at all. That it talks about that the West can support Ukraine to a Ukrainian victory over the lands in the east and the south and liberate those territories. But it doesn't mention at any point in the article that I found any talking about Ukraine and manpower issues, mobilization and recruitment. It doesn't bring that up, which I believe is the largest limiting factor, not if we lean in and support from the West. But it does mention Russian manpower. So again, you see where this has that bias brought in. If you're talking about Ukraine victories on the battlefield, military actions, and you're not talking manpower, if that isn't like one or two in your points, you've lost me at that point. Now, it talks about nuclear weapons and puts them as a basis of the Kremlin's real power, not just projected power. But it completely ignores the idea that these could actually be used. So you're saying this is a basis of real power. You're saying the perception then, therefore, is this and that. But it is completely accepting, well, they're accepting that, no, this will never be used. But what, and I agree, likely won't be. But it ignores that, could that be used if there is a threat to the Russian Federation? So you're not talking about, obviously, the Americans, have blatantly said that there was real threats at some point of this. There are threats made by the Kremlin often about nuclear stuff, and we have seen the head of NATO, not the head of NATO, who was he? I looked at him yesterday though, but was saying if Russia didn't have nukes, we would have gone on. So obviously there is some real threat there that people are taking seriously. So it ignores that it's like, yeah, they exist, but they're not going to be used, so you ignore it in your calculations. You can't ignore that, nor can you ignore manpower. And it basically disregards any other opinions that are formed around this war other than this as a product of Russian information campaigns. That if you have anything other than this, that you've been influenced by these amplifiers, blind spots, and therefore you're in this perception of what it is. Anyway, the notion that Ukraine war is unwinnable because of Russia's dominance is a Russian information operation. Maybe it's looking at figures of men and where that map is moving, which gives the glimpse of the Kremlin's real strategy and only real hope of success. They must get the US on the sidelines. But also an easier way to get the US on the sidelines is winning and some level of negotiation that if Trump wants to end the war. The Kremlin needs the US to choose inaction and embrace the false inevitability that Russia will prevail in Ukraine. Putin's center of gravity is his ability to shape the will and decisions of the West, Ukraine, and Russia itself. But again, sort of shaking off any problems internally and saying, no, but all this is just influenced by an information campaign. I don't believe those information campaigns are as successful as people would like to believe. Is there some level of, in elections, is there some other states trying to push one way or another? Likely, yes. How effective is it? Well, we don't really know. Probably not as effective as people would think. So you can't just pay off someone's complete opinion based on facts and based on their experience, how they see it, and what the data is showing to say it is this. If you're going to speak about Ukraine can win if we lean in and surge, you cannot ignore. We can lean in and surge all the weapon systems in the world. Ukraine's going to need a hell of a lot of manpower. Is that doable? I don't know. But you can't ignore that as a whole thing and say if anyone has any concerns about this from manpower perspective, from what if a nuclear bomb drops on any of that, and just disregard that as misinformation or that you've been influenced by an information campaign, you're not going to have me. Now, let's look at the maps. We have a lot in here. So, of course, here is Ukraine, the center. Here is the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Of course, the red check is areas where Russia has made ground over the last 24 hours. Now, actually, before we come down into here, the quickest part will be around Sudzha. Of course, Ukraine and Russia have a lot of resources and men in here. Russia trying to recover some of this territory. Ukraine trying to hold some of this territory. Between yesterday and today, that we do see a reduction in Ukrainian-controlled territory around Pokrovsk in here, which is where Suryak has been saying the Russians have pushed into. But where I want to come is down around Kursk, Antonivka area. Antonivka is right here, and talk about this as one whole front. As you can see, Russia has made some gains in here. So let's have a look at this. And then we'll talk about Kupiansk and where the Russians got about 4Ks in yesterday and whether that was successful or unsuccessful. So we have a lot to go over in here. Now, Antonivka down in here and Ileninka, we have some geolocated footage, at least in Antonivka, to go over. So let's have a look at where this geolocation is. So it's right on the outskirts of this territory today. So right down in here, what we can see is Russian forces again clearing positions in here. Sorry, I'll turn down my audio, and we can see movement of these forces through here and basically house-to-house fighting. Now, one thing I see in this footage that strikes me straight away, like instantly, now I don't know who these forces are, but from the gear they've got on to just their movement on the ground, and I speak from an infantry perspective, these guys seem a lot more highly trained than your average grunt that I see fighting on the Russian side here. So take that as you will, but these guys look to have a lot higher skill at arms than I've seen. So increase in training if it's not a special unit, or if it is a special unit, working right on the edges of that area. But I will say there has definitely been an increase in Russia's baseline skill in a lot of areas at the moment. We saw that in Volchansk, of course, with those guys, I believe, though, FSB working alongside. We can just see, because they're wearing like 50 grand worth of gear, Cry Precision, airframe helmets and the such. And then we can see where a Russian flag is here after that area was cleared. So let's talk about Antonivka down in here, where we can see this advancement has taken place. And then also Noel reports, showing Antonivka coming under control, but he shows far more control out into the east than Deep State map does. Remember, Noel is, of course, a Ukrainian source. So let's look at Antonivka down and what this is developing around Dalny, where we saw Russia advance yesterday. So you can see around from Trudove, Dalny in here, that Russia is pushing on both of these flanks, and that this is creating some level of sort of envelopment of this entire area all the way down into Antonivka. And you can see by this one here, by Siversk, saying that there is 6 kilometers, as he's saying that Russia has advanced out from Maximivka, and in this area, shown by the red here, Russian army took control of several positions south of Maximilivka. On the other hand, Russian forces made up new advances. They captured Dalny with only 6 kilometers remains to join Russian troops at the north. Result: Ukrainian army began withdrawal from the salient located the last part of Mariansk district under its control. So what he's saying is that this is getting closer and closer. Let's go grey zone to grey zone, to talking bang on what he said about 6Ks, that this is really shortening up, that Ukraine may have to withdraw out of this area in here, what of course creates a massive flank issue for Kursk and where the defensive lines sit in this front line. And of course that shortening up is going to be able to put more pressure on one single point also. So then let's talk about Kursk and where we are seeing things shift around here, of course, around Ilininkia as well. I'm pretty sure I have a geolocation, but we may get to it later. So that's what Siversk says. The situation of the Ukrainian army is much more difficult than it seems. The Russian army has completely broken through the eastern defences of Kursk. There were and are not enough troops to fill the trenches. Dalny is about to be taken by the Russians. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian retreat is accelerating in the southern salient. Combing operations to Antonivka are already taking place, as we showed you, since the abandonment of the locality of the western defences. In addition, Russian forces are advancing easily north of Maximivka and that area here, which we showed on Siversk's previous map. Troops are closer to these areas. Most worryingly, the order to withdraw from Kursk has not yet been given, and withdrawal is becoming less feasible by the day. Only the urban area with a thermal power station offer a place of cover and entrenchment. However, from a military point of view, the Ukrainian fortresses' days are numbered, so there hasn't been an order to pull out of Kursk. We'll see this in Financial Times article in a bit, but the ability to withdraw out of here may be getting limited, especially with Russia swinging around Ilininkia and fire control then north to south. So let's look at where the fortifications are and where this is saying. So this is Ilininkia. Around here, it is showing, sorry, this is the one I wanted to show. This is day 993. So ground made, and this breaking into the outskirts of Kursk by Siversk map. This is showing only grey zone here, but also in Ilininka, Beletsky, that Russia is making more ground on the northern shore here too. Then we step up to his most recent map, and you can see expansion of control around here too. But this is the part that I'm most interested in, is Dalny coming under a lot of control, but also where these major fortifications that have sat for a significant amount of time fairly quickly, relatively quickly, coming under Russian control. The Russian army broke the eastern defence line of the Ukrainian army and Kursk town, taking control over several positions in the axis, including the locality of Dalny. Moreover, Russian forces advanced north of Ilininkia and captured the trench systems in this direction. In addition, clash with Ukrainian armies. Forces began in the outskirts of Beletsky and Novy-Ilininka. So this area and where these breakthroughs have been. This is a very, very important area in here. And of course, this dam has been taken down. Was this dam taken down to try and stop the Russians being able to do this? Or was it taken out by the Russians to stop this N15 road being usable? Again, we don't know. The explosion definitely looks like a controlled demolition, but still up for speculation. So that is Antonivka, Kursk done. Let's move our way into Seladov while we're here. So you can see there is a large amount of ground being made out to the south, just south of Seledov and to the west of Petrivka on this map today. So let's move on here and show you what then, of course, Suryak is saying. So he shows some ground being made out along this railway and this road here on day 993, and then on 994 shows an expansion of this control out from Seledov, increasing control up this paddock where my cursor is, as well to the north through Petrivka and Hrovkia as well. So expanding this flank, of course, that threatens Pokrovsk and Minograd, but I believe this is still secondary to trying to get down to where the Vovcha reservoir is in here, Kurukov, and a push in. This is an area I think we could see fall very quickly once it starts falling. Like I've said again and again, I should have said this at the data, attritional war can be like going bankrupt, little by little, then all at once. Now, one of the areas you probably most want me to speak about is, of course, this grey zone that headed into Kupiansk. Yesterday, we saw some 4Ks behind the line where Russian forces were able to move armoured vehicles and drop off troops in here, although looking like they took large losses. One thing I will say is this is still now today shown as grey zone, not recovered. So take that as you then will, but it's hard to get an idea in here. Now, what we will have in the future, if this is unsuccessful, we will see nothing happen in here and maybe this get closed back up. If it is successful, we will see then the fight for Kupiansk start. This is a major development if that could have happened. And like I said, you can't just pay off everything to, oh, it's craziness, it's this, it's that. Why did that go ahead? At what point did a commander go, yep, let's see that we've summed up that this is going to happen? So, a few differing opinions. Zelensky has said this morning, began as always with a report from Commander Sirsky. Not just the Donetsk region, but also Kupiansk direction, our warriors there have performed incredibly effectively. So saying that in this exact area, it is incredibly effective in Southern Front and Kursk as well. We'll look at, oh no, we already looked at Kursk. So Kiev independent, they're saying that Ukraine repels Russian attempts to enter Kupiansk. All Russian attacks in this direction were successfully repelled. Russian invaders failed to enter Kupiansk. Well, they definitely did enter, but it looks like they potentially weren't there to hold. So again, like I said, we will either see that they're there or that they're not. Time will tell us. And we see this from the Kiev, a reporter for Kiev Independent. But one of the main things why this is significant, even if Russia got completely pushed back in here and that got taken out, where the fuck are the defences that have sat, say, 4 kilometres down here? It's passed by all of that. It's passed by mines, it's passed by fortifications, it's passed by a hell of a lot. And this is where people are saying, could there be an abandonment of like the whole area through here if the logistics aren't possible at some point? That's more the concern. It's not that, you know, a dozen troops or a dozen and a half were going to make some huge fight on Kupiansk. Is that got down there with relatively small effort, really. Now, this guy here, Francis Farrell, of course, works for Kiev Independent. The enemy, translating this from a Ukrainian, and so the enemy there had the advantage. They had forces, had infantry, and motivation for that infantry. So remember, you can have infantry, but they need to be motivated also. This is why I do say Russia launching these attacks still does say that the commanders and the armoured and mechanised infantry still have motivation to move forward too. Otherwise, those attacks would look like what we saw in late 22, much of which has been made up of convicts or guys on contract who have served less time than our groups had spent on rotation in the forest. True story. We didn't have any of that there. So didn't have the numbers, the motivation. That's what I'm reading into this, but that these guys are fresh soldiers too, that the rotation has been so slow for the Ukrainian forces up around here. For a very long time, the fighting in Kupiansk was medium to high intensity, but earned less attention than Donbass and other areas with more movement because the defence was solid. Eventually, though, the attritional infantry fighting played its course with the expected result. So it's attritional, attrit down, less forces. Russia has more forces in this area, that we see things like this breakthrough that has occurred there. And that is an important part of defence. Even if it wasn't successful, it needs to be taken into account of that's not a good thing to be happening because one may be successful. Now, a Russian page here said Kupiansk information about these groups being squeezed out of the city and being disseminated in information channels associated with Ukrainian armed forces. According to our sources, there is a battle going on. There are reinforcements of the Russian armed forces arriving there. Multiple launch rocket systems and aviations are now operating in the city right now. So this is what I'm trying to add is some perspective here. At least a Russian page is saying that there is other reinforcements deployed into here, and that there are aviation working and multiple launch rocket systems too. I'm surprised with this push that we didn't see TOS. Maybe I'm wrong, I haven't seen, but TOS working in here, as absolutely we've seen FABs. But like I say, it seems to be Russia launched FABs on an area. They launched TOS, then a reconnaissance element, armoured reconnaissance, MTLBs went in here. That's what that is. And then a larger wave. So will we see more pushes on this and opening up maybe the intensity on a new front line? This is what, if you are the side with the larger amount of troops, what you try and do is just start as many front lines as you can hold to keep your other side, Ukraine in this case, running between point to point, trying to stabilise a deteriorating situation. And I say the situation everywhere is deteriorating, and I believe the data shows this. It's not that Russia doesn't have problems of their own, but it just seems like things are deteriorating much faster for Ukraine than Russia. And where we meet that point of like collapse, I think if you would have a race, both are going there, but I believe Ukraine is moving more quickly. Again, I don't know. But we move into Bakhmut Chasiv Yar, and there is some interesting footage and geolocation to show you here. So this is the geolocation along this road up from Kupiansk, of course, where the canal runs right in about here. Now what we can see here, I can't show you this footage on YouTube, but is Ukrainian drones targeting Russian infantry positions. And these are dug in positions, so we definitely know there are troops in and around here. And this gets backed up by even Ukrainian maps like this from Kupiansk to Klishkivka in here, showing that there are Russian forces present and holding territory in here, being ignored by this map. Well over a month now, there has been geolocations shown in many different areas in here and fighting back and forth that should be at minimum grey zone and other areas at red. So let's talk what Siversk says in here. The front north of Bakhmut is being reactivated. A new axis began advance towards Siversk from the south, so to the north up in here, which I'll show you that map in 1 second, so that this will become relevant again. But Siversk shows where these Russian geolocated footage was, where those positions were, but also gaining more area out from Klishkivka as well. Russia began operations to expel Ukrainian army to the last positions east of the water canal, taking control over a series of positions as well. So by NOAL reports, Siversk, we can see that likely there was some level of Russian advancement and more control in this area. But we said they're reactivating to the north. So let's have a look at this. We have Williams Siversk. This area hasn't moved in a long time. We've seen Russian command then say how good the Ukrainian defensive works are in here, but we are seeing some movements happening here, which could mean soldiers are tired and not rotated or being moved to stabilize other areas. So let's have a look at this. So where we're looking, have a look at Vimimkia, Rozdalivka, and Fedorivka as well. Now the easiest way to line up where this is the train line. So it is saying that right out to about where my cursor is here is controlled by the Russians for some time, that fall of Vimimkia, but also the Russian army restarted the advances here, and they're on the outskirts of Fedorovkia, right up in here to closing up this sector. That is what Siversk is saying across an update and a map post also. So again, we will see. Now, where we're going to go to next, let's push up into here. And of course, we have the Pishani front and we have the Persho-Travnevi front in here, where we did see a map update yesterday by Deep State on this. And we can see that Siversk is saying the Russian army fully secured the locality of Persho-Travnevi, so pushing further down into here across this road onto Kupiansk by this red dot here by Siversk maps. Now let's move our way down into the south a little bit. So we can see, if this is still turned on, that there is some ground being made out of Rivnepil, of course, Velika Novosilivka. This could be a real point of contention in here, knowing where those fortification lines are sitting. So let's have a look here. Now, this is Rivnepil, so showing very similar between these two maps, but Siversk showing more advancement out to the west here. Also, this is Novodarivkia here, so more of a push out there, but again, lining up pretty close of where we are seeing advancements. But while we're here, of course, this is Starmorsky. Let's have a look at the latest update from Siversk in this direction. Of course, you can see where the waterway is running down in here and showing out from Starmorsky to the northeast. Russia is having more push as well out to the further east near Novodonetsky as well. This is this red dot that Russia is pushing to the west, but also filling in between Rivnepil and this Novovdarivkia as well in here. So wait and see how this front line evolves along here. Now, I can't drink alcohol at the moment, but I have been saying when this map updates in Robotny, I will have a beer. But we have a couple of frontline updates in here. Huliopol, Orokhiv, both areas if you want to go back and watch my videos interviewing people and seeing actions in here that I've made videos on the ground in here. But we have a couple of Syriac updates in here. So the first one is in this direction of Huliopol. So if we zoom in here, this red dot is this Doroz, I won't try and pronounce it, but saying that the Russian forces are basically in line where this train line turns out to the northwest. So saying the Russians have restarted this push here and are pushing to the north to Huliopol, as well out from Marfapil further. Will we see a battle for Huliopol? I am unsure. But also down Orokhiv, Robotny front, zoom in one to get a better idea. This is what we see here, where Syriac is showing where the Russians have moved. Now this can be hard because it looks so different. See where this turn is in the road out to the north west? This is where Syriac is showing the Russians are up to, is filling in this whole gap along here. So something along the lines of like this or further, probably further on this front line in here. Again, we'll wait and see. I think there may be some reservation to a map update in Robotny and Starmorsky front more so than anywhere else due to the connections of this map, due to the information war and where Ukraine had the then 2023 failed counter-offensives. I think if anywhere's not to update, it's there. Potentially Bakhmut, where there was successful offensives as well, pushing back under here. Well, successful offensives there, and this, as far as overall, was unsuccessful, knowing the goals what it was. Now, let's talk about this Financial Times very, very quickly. I know we're getting long. I don't know if anyone's still here. If you're still here at this point, let me know in the comments. Ukraine's military is rushing medics to the front line in anticipation of an intensified Russian onslaught as both sides fight for territorial advantage. Military officials, soldiers and analysts see the next few months as a critical phase of war, with Ukraine attempting to stabilise defences and strengthen its position in case it's forced to negotiate with Moscow. So they want to go to a position of power. I just don't see how it's going to shift in 2 months. Moscow's ramped up attacks. Ukraine's forces have been unable to hold the line in the east, where Russian troops are now advancing at a faster rate than any point of 22. Ukrainian officials have admitted their defences are crumbling amid manpower shortages. Kiev expects the offensive to gather pace, and Ukrainian army spokesman told the Financial Times that more medical personnel were being sent to the Eastern Front in anticipation of heavy battles in the coming days and weeks, particularly in the south and east. Go back to what Mr. Helen said. A battle is also shaping in Russia's Kursk region, which parts of Ukraine sees in a surprise incursion in Kursk. But Russia is readying a force of about 50,000 soldiers, including North Koreans, in a fresh attempt to push the Ukrainians back. I haven't seen any evidence of a force that large or the North Koreans there yet, but there is potential of this. But if Ukraine is able to stop Russian offensive and seize initiative by the time Trump takes office in January 20s, senior Ukrainian officials believe they could prove that they are fighters and winners to help convince the president-elect to stand by them. Now, I believe this could be true if Valery Zaluzny was listened to 12 months ago and he said we need 500,000 men because they would be entering the battlefield now. Seize the initiative by January 20, I highly doubt. Again, January 20, I'll still be here, hopefully. We'll talk about it. In Kursk, Russia is rushing to take back at least the city of Sudzha, where Ukraine has set up its military command, if not all of Ukrainian-held territory before Trump is sworn in. The 10,000 North Korean troops recently deployed to fight alongside Russian soldiers could help tilt the balance of Moscow in Moscow's favour in Kursk region. It's a huge number and you cannot disregard it. A senior West, even at the end of the day, if it's 50,000, 10,000, it's a fifth. It is a large percentage, 20%. But again, I haven't seen evidence of this, and we have seen that those haven't been pulled off anywhere else on the front line. Apparently, that whole 50,000 is a whole new force. The problem is, does that push into Sumy? Losing Kursk would deprive Zelensky of a valuable bargaining chip in any potential talks with Moscow, which he said will enter only if Russia completely withdraws from Ukraine. Now, what I'll say is Kursk, what Ukraine is occupying there, is about 400 to 600 square kilometres at best, and Russia occupy about 111,000 square kilometres. So it even, a 5 to 1. And there's areas in Sudzha and in that Kursk area occupied is not as important as areas like Avdiivka, even Kurakov. So even if it's 5 to 1, it's going to be fairly irrelevant. It's not a huge bargaining chip. It sure as hell doesn't put Ukraine in a position of strength if there was a territorial negotiation. At several flashpoints along a 1,000-kilometre front line, Ukrainian troops enduring relentless, I can't read, Russian air and ground assaults. A commander of the artillery unit near Kursk, where the fighting is most intense, told the Financial Times on Monday the troops were attacking from 3 sides. He and his troops are ready to pull back, but we do not have the order from the top yet. So Kursk, this is what we're talking about. Want to fall back, but can't. The city of Pokrovsk, a critical logistics hubs for Ukrainian army and are largely destroyed. The coking plant, the outskirts of Pokrovsk, that has come under attack is the largest in Ukraine and crucial to its steel manufacturing industry. Remember, any ground without vital industrial capacity or areas is, in attritional warfare, irrelevant. The military think tank estimated by December the front line will probably shift 30 to 35 kilometre west of its current position. So they're saying of its current position, 30 to 35 kilometres west, that would be massive. That is about as far as Avdiivka is now. Now, I'm not saying I really agree with that. So that's 17. Can I go? So about out to here. I don't think it will shift that far. Maybe in and around down Kursk front. So let's see what distance we're talking about. Let's take it off here. Shit, I'd still be shocked, but I guess it lines up if it does there. But again, time will tell us. General Major Dmytro Marchenko last month said the Eastern Front was crumbling. Own shortages of ammunition and manpower. People are very exhausted. They simply cannot hold the fronts they are on. Again, this goes back into the ISW thing I showed you. How can you ignore manpower? People go, oh, you always talk about manpower. Yes, I believe it's the most important thing in attritional war. And the doctrine agrees with me. Manpower, especially infantry, remains Ukraine's biggest challenge, according to commanders. The average age is already over 40 in various brigades, and there doesn't seem to be enough reinforcements arriving at the front line. Speaking in negotiations too, it's going to, I believe, with Trump and how he sees things, and I don't know Trump very well, but if the question, he may pose the question to Ukraine, to Zelensky, why haven't you mobilised 18 to 25? If you're trying to create bargaining chips here, you'll need some from you as well. Ukraine has planned to draft an additional 160,000 troops between November and February. And Defence Council's replenished military units to only about 85% of what is needed. Remember, no unit should ever drop below 70% strength in attritional warfare by the doctrine, but this is still nowhere near enough. It's going to still take, if they're only drafting at this, it's going to take mid-next year at an absolute minimum. Again, Zaluzny, I believe, was correct. But military experts and one senior Kiev official have expressed scepticism that the target will be reached, saying it's only realistic to expect up to 100,000 to be drafted. That would fill about half of the manpower gap. Several Ukrainian commanders and soldiers said the efforts to attract more men to the army were hampered by military service being open-ended. Kyiv was wary of passing a law on demobilisation that fears could lead to an exodus of soldiers. Again, this is what people are asking for, is we need laws around rotation and demobilisation. Therefore, people aren't joining up. A lot of guys see mobilisation as a death sentence, hence why so many people are avoiding it. A prominent Ukrainian journalist and soldier said that without a clear answer about the period of service and quality of training, the recruits will be demoralised and ineffective as the current battle-weary infantry. And like if we go back to what those guys said about the situation in Kupiansk, these are guys that have been in the military on the Russian side for shorter than these guys have been even rotated off that line. To make up for shortages, some infantry have been allegedly bolstered with Air Force pilots, engineers, medics, and surgeons, which we have seen. Yuri Ignat, the colonel of the Air Force official, he had said that's what we referred to back then. The Ukraine Army spokesman strongly denied the allegations that Ignat had misspoken. Air Force units, including engineers, pilots, maintenance staff, and medical teams, remain under their specialised positions. Two commanders leading units on the Eastern Front and skilled personnel, including medics, had been previously deployed to the infantry. War requires these things sometimes, said one of the commanders. I've sent cooks to the trenches before. A senior fellow at this Endowment for International Peace, who recently visited the front line, said Russia was just overwhelming the Ukrainians because they have more resources now. They may not be skilled attacks, but the consistency and frequency of these things is wearing down the Ukrainian side. Last slide. Any advantage in manpower and equipment counts. The Western security officials said, though Russia will probably run into difficulties maintaining this arms industry rates by the end of next year, Ukraine has much bigger problems now. And that's what I'll say. Both sides are burning the candle, but I believe Ukraine's is much closer to being extinguished if there's not major shifts. So, again, we will see how things go. Legends, have a fantastic weekend. Look after yourselves. If you'd like to support me, there's links down below, but never feel obliged. Thank you. Bye-bye.